The August sun beat down on the Utah desert like a hammer against an anvil, and Nolan Jameson had been riding for 3 days straight when he saw what looked like a pile of fabric crumpled beside the dusty trail. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Copper, nickered nervously as they approached, and Nolan's hand instinctively moved to the pistol at his hip before he realized what he was seeing. A woman lay motionless on the ground, her dark hair spread around her head like a halo, her skin flushed dangerously red from exposure to the relentless heat. He was off his horse in seconds, dropping to his knees beside her still form, his heart hammering against his ribs as he pressed 2 fingers to her neck and felt the faint, thready pulse beneath her burning skin. "Hold on," he muttered, reaching for his canteen with hands that shook slightly despite years of steady gun work and hard living. The water sloshed inside the leather container, and he uncapped it quickly, pouring a small stream across her parched lips and heated face. She did not stir immediately, and panic clawed at his chest as he continued to dribble water over her forehead, her cheeks, watching as the liquid carved clean trails through the dust that coated her skin. Her eyelids fluttered but did not open, and Nolan knew with absolute certainty that if he left her here even another 10 minutes, the desert would claim her completely. He scanned the landscape with experienced eyes, spotting a cluster of rocks about 30 yards off the trail where a scraggly juniper tree offered a patch of blessed shade. Without hesitation, he slid his arms beneath her knees and shoulders, lifting her with a grunt of effort. She was heavier than she looked, solid and real in his arms, and her head lolled against his chest as he carried her across the scorched earth. Her dress was a simple blue calico, torn at the hem and stained with sweat and dirt, and he could feel the heat radiating from her body even through the fabric. The shade felt like stepping into a different world, the temperature dropping a blessed few degrees, and Nolan lowered her carefully onto the sparse grass that grew in the protected spot. He pulled off his hat and used it to fan her face, continuing to wet his bandana and press it against her forehead, her neck, the insides of her wrists where he knew the blood ran close to the surface. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness, and he found himself talking to her. A steady stream of words meant more to calm his own nerves than anything else. "Come on now, open those eyes. You have fought too hard to give up now. Stay with me." Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and he carefully dribbled more water into her mouth, tilting her head to help her swallow reflexively. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, her eyelashes fluttered against her cheeks. Her eyes opened slowly, revealing irises the color of honey shot through with green, and they focused on his face with obvious confusion and fear. She tried to sit up, gasping, and he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder to keep her still. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "You are safe. You passed out from the heat. Just lie still and drink some more water." She stared at him for a long moment, her chest heaving with rapid breaths, and he could see her mind working behind those unusual eyes, trying to piece together what had happened. He held the canteen to her lips again, and this time she drank more deeply, coughing a little as the water went down too fast. When she had drained half the canteen, he pulled it away despite her small sound of protest. "Not too much at once," he said. "You will make yourself sick." Her voice, when she finally spoke, was rough and barely above a whisper. "My wagon. Where is my wagon?" Nolan frowned, looking back toward the trail where he had found her. He had seen no wagon, no horse, nothing but her collapsed form and the endless stretch of desert. "There was no wagon when I found you. How long have you been out here?" Her face crumpled, and he saw tears gather in her eyes, though she fought them back with visible effort. "I do not know. Since yesterday morning, maybe. The wheel broke and my horse bolted when a rattlesnake spooked him. I tried to fix it, but I could not, and I thought if I walked I could reach Taylorsville by nightfall, but I must have gotten turned around." Her voice broke on the last words, and she pressed a hand over her eyes. "Everything I own was in that wagon." "We will look for it," Nolan said, though he suspected that in this vast landscape, an abandoned wagon could be anywhere within a 10-mile radius, and who knew what scavengers might have already found it. "But right now, we need to get you somewhere safe. Taylorsville is about 15 miles north of here. Can you ride?" She lowered her hand and looked at him properly for the first time, taking in his weathered face, the lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, the dark stubble on his jaw, the worn leather vest over his faded blue shirt. He was not a young man, probably in his early 30s, with the lean, tough build of someone who had spent his entire life working hard under an unforgiving sky. But his eyes were kind, a startling blue-gray that held genuine concern, and something in her chest loosened slightly. "I think so," she said. "I am Tessa Lawson." "Nolan Jameson," he replied, and the corner of his mouth quirked up in something that was not quite a smile. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Lawson, though I wish it were under better circumstances." He helped her to her feet, keeping a steadying hand on her elbow as she swayed dangerously. Her legs felt like water beneath her, and black spots danced at the edges of her vision, but she gritted her teeth and forced herself to remain upright. Nolan watched her with obvious approval, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw, the determination that had probably kept her alive when a weaker person would have simply laid down and died. "We will take it slow," he said, guiding her toward where Copper waited patiently, reins trailing on the ground. "Stop me if you feel faint again." Getting her into the saddle proved more difficult than he had anticipated. She was weak and unsteady, and twice she nearly slid right off the other side before he managed to haul her back. Finally, he swung up behind her, settling her in front of him with one arm wrapped securely around her waist to keep her from falling. She stiffened at the intimate contact, but exhaustion won out over propriety, and after a moment she relaxed back against his chest, her head dropping to rest against his shoulder. "Sleep if you need to," he murmured near her ear. "I will not let you fall." The ride to Taylorsville took nearly 4 hours in the brutal afternoon heat, and Nolan stopped frequently to give both Tessa and Copper water and rest. Each time they paused, he checked Tessa's pulse and breathing, relieved to find both growing stronger as her body slowly recovered from its ordeal. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes alert enough to talk in short, broken sentences, other times so deeply asleep that he wondered if he should be more concerned. But her color was better, the dangerous flush fading to a more normal pink, and he allowed himself to hope that she would be all right. During one of her lucid periods, she asked him what he did, and he told her he was a ranch hand, working on one of the big cattle operations south of Salt Lake City. He had been on his way back from delivering a message to a ranch in Nevada when he found her, a task that was supposed to be simple, but had been complicated by every delay imaginable. She, in turn, told him that she was a widow, that her husband had died 2 years ago in a mining accident back in Colorado, and that she had been traveling to Taylorsville to start fresh, to open a dressmaking shop with the small inheritance her husband had left her. "All my fabric was in that wagon," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "My sewing machine, my patterns, everything. 2 years' worth of savings and planning, and it is all gone." "We will find it," Nolan said again, and this time he meant it, even though he had no idea how he would make good on that promise. Something about this woman, about the quiet courage she showed in the face of devastating loss, made him want to fix things for her, to see her smile instead of fighting back tears. Taylorsville appeared on the horizon just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. A small collection of buildings clustered around a main street that could not have been more than a quarter-mile long. It was not much, but after the endless expanse of desert, it looked like paradise to Tessa's grateful eyes. Nolan rode straight to the doctor's office, a small wooden building with a hand-painted sign hanging above the door, and carefully lifted Tessa down from the saddle. Her legs buckled immediately, and he caught her, sweeping her back up into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. The doctor, a balding man in his 50s named Henry Morrison, took one look at Tessa's condition and ushered them into his examining room. He shooed Nolan out despite the cowboy's obvious reluctance to leave, and for the next 30 minutes, Nolan paced the small waiting area like a caged animal, his boots wearing a path in the already thin floorboards. When Dr. Morrison finally emerged, wiping his hands on a clean towel, Nolan was on him in an instant. "She will be fine," the doctor said before Nolan could ask. "Heat exhaustion, dehydration, some minor sunburn and cuts on her feet from walking without proper shoes. But you found her in time. Another hour or two, and we would be having a very different conversation." He fixed Nolan with a measured look. "She is lucky you came along when you did." Nolan felt the tension drain from his shoulders, leaving him suddenly aware of his own exhaustion. He had been running on adrenaline for hours, and now that he knew Tessa would be all right, his body was demanding rest. But there were practicalities to address first. "She needs a place to stay," he said. "She lost everything when her wagon broke down. Does this town have a boarding house, Doctor?" Morrison nodded. "Sarah Jenkins runs a respectable place 2 doors down. Clean rooms, decent food, reasonable rates. I will send word that she is coming." He paused, then added, "Miss Lawson mentioned you were the one who found her. She seems quite grateful." "I just did what anyone would do," Nolan said, uncomfortable with the praise. "Perhaps," the doctor replied, "but not everyone would have bothered to bring her all the way here. You are a good man, Mr. Jameson." Nolan did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded and asked if he could see Tessa. Dr. Morrison led him back to the examining room, where Tessa sat on the edge of a narrow bed, looking small and fragile in a clean white nightgown that the doctor must have provided. Her face was clean now, her hair brushed back and braided loosely over one shoulder, and despite the bandages on her feet and the tired shadows under her eyes, she was beautiful. The thought caught Nolan off guard, and he had to clear his throat before he could speak. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better," she said, and managed a small smile. "Thanks to you. Dr. Morrison told me what you did, carrying me all that way. I owe you my life." "You owe me nothing," Nolan said firmly. "I am just glad I found you when I did." He hesitated, then continued, "The doctor says you need rest. There is a boarding house in town where you can stay. I will cover the cost until you get back on your feet." Tessa's eyes widened and color flooded her cheeks. "I cannot accept that. You have already done so much." "You do not have a choice," Nolan said, and his tone was gentle but left no room for argument. "Consider it a loan if it makes you feel better. You can pay me back once you get your shop up and running." She looked like she wanted to protest further, but exhaustion won out, and she simply nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. "I do not know how I will ever repay such kindness." Nolan arranged for her room at the boarding house and carried her there himself, ignoring her embarrassed protests that she could walk. Sarah Jenkins, a warm, motherly woman in her 40s, clucked over Tessa like a hen with one chick, showing them to a small but comfortable room on the second floor with a window that looked out over the main street. The bed was covered with a cheerful quilt in shades of blue and yellow, and there was a washstand with a porcelain basin and pitcher, a small wardrobe, and a rocking chair in the corner. "I will bring up some supper in an hour," Sarah said, bustling around the room and pulling back the covers on the bed. "Nothing too heavy, just some broth and bread to start. You need to ease your stomach back into food after what you have been through, dear." After Sarah left, Nolan set Tessa down on the bed and stepped back, suddenly aware of the impropriety of being alone with her in a bedroom. She seemed to realize it at the same time, and an awkward silence fell between them. Finally, Nolan cleared his throat. "I should let you rest," he said. "I will be in town for a few days at the hotel across the street. If you need anything at all, just send word." "Wait," Tessa said as he turned to leave. He paused, looking back at her. "Will you help me look for my wagon? I know it is asking a lot, but I do not know anyone else here, and I cannot bear the thought of losing everything without at least trying to find it." Nolan should have said no. He was already 3 days behind schedule, and his boss at the ranch would not be pleased about the delay. But when he looked at Tessa, at the hope and fear warring in those honey-green eyes, he found himself nodding before he even realized he was doing it. "I will start looking tomorrow," he promised. "You focus on getting your strength back." The smile she gave him was like the sun coming out from behind clouds, bright and warm and grateful. And Nolan left the boarding house feeling like he had just made either the best or the worst decision of his life. He spent that night at the small hotel, lying awake in a lumpy bed and staring at the ceiling, unable to stop thinking about Tessa Lawson. He kept seeing her face as she lay unconscious in the dirt, kept feeling the weight of her body in his arms as he carried her to safety. She had gotten under his skin somehow, this stranger he had known for less than a day, and the intensity of his concern for her was both unexpected and unwelcome. Nolan had learned long ago not to let himself care too much about anyone. Life in the West was hard and often short, and attachment only led to pain when people inevitably left or died or simply moved on to the next opportunity. He had friends, sure, but no one close, no one who really mattered. It was safer that way. But Tessa was different, and he could not quite explain why. Maybe it was the vulnerability he had seen in her, the way she had fought so hard to stay conscious, to stay alive. Maybe it was the quiet dignity she maintained even when faced with the loss of everything she owned. Or maybe it was simply that she needed help, and Nolan had always been a sucker for people in need, even when it meant trouble for himself. He rose at dawn and headed straight to the general store, where he bought supplies for a search expedition. Extra water, dried meat, rope, a compass, and a spare canteen. The store owner, a chatty man named Bill Palmer, was happy to share what he knew about the surrounding area, pointing out on a hand-drawn map the most likely routes someone traveling from Colorado might have taken. There were 2 main trails and several smaller paths that branched off from them, offering plenty of places where a broken wagon might have been left behind. Before heading out, Nolan stopped at the boarding house to check on Tessa. Sarah let him in with a knowing smile that made his ears burn, and he climbed the stairs to Tessa's room, knocking softly on the door. Her voice called out for him to enter, and he found her sitting in the rocking chair, wearing what must have been a borrowed dress of plain brown cotton that was slightly too large for her slender frame. She looked much better than she had the night before, the color back in her cheeks, her eyes clear and alert. "You are up early," she said, and there was something in her expression, a kind of pleased surprise that made his chest feel tight. "I wanted to get started on the search," he said. "I have supplies and some ideas about where to look. If I ride hard, I should be able to cover a lot of ground before dark." "I want to come with you," Tessa said immediately, standing up. Nolan shook his head. You need to rest. Dr. Morrison said at least 2 days of bed rest. I have been resting all night, she argued. And it is my wagon. I should be there when you find it. If I find it, Nolan corrected. Tessa, you can barely walk. How do you expect to spend all day on horseback? She lifted her chin stubbornly. I can manage, please, Nolan. I cannot just sit here doing nothing while you risk yourself for my sake. They argued back and forth for several minutes, but eventually, Nolan had to admit defeat. There was steel beneath Tessa's soft exterior, a core of determination that he recognized because he saw it in himself every time he looked in a mirror. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Fine, he said. But if you feel sick or faint, you tell me immediately. And I reserve the right to turn back if I think you are pushing yourself too hard. Her answering smile was triumphant and just a little smug. Deal. Nolan borrowed a gentle mare from the livery stable for Tessa to ride, and they set out as the sun was climbing toward its midday peak. Tessa sat her horse well despite her injuries, and Nolan found himself studying her profile as they rode, admiring the straight line of her nose, the determined set of her jaw. She caught him looking once and raised an eyebrow in question, and he quickly turned his attention back to the trail, feeling like a schoolboy caught passing notes in class. They searched for hours, following the most likely route Tessa would have taken and stopping frequently to scan the landscape with field glasses Nolan had borrowed from the general store. The desert was vast and empty, broken only by the occasional outcropping of rock or stunted tree, and Nolan felt his hope beginning to fade as the day wore on. Wagons did not simply disappear, but in country like this, they might as well have. A broken wagon could be hidden behind any of 1,000 ridges or gullies, and without knowing exactly where Tessa had been when the wheel broke, they were searching blind. Around mid-afternoon, they stopped to rest the horses and eat some of the dried meat and hard biscuits Nolan had packed. Tessa was quiet, staring out at the endless expanse of sand and rock, and he could see the discouragement settling over her like a heavy cloak. We will find it, he said, and wished he felt as confident as he tried to sound. You do not have to keep saying that, Tessa replied, not looking at him. I know the odds. In a landscape this big, a single wagon is like looking for a needle in a haystack. Then we will search every inch of the haystack if we have to, Nolan said stubbornly. I am not giving up, and neither should you. She turned to look at him then, and there was something in her eyes that made his breath catch. Why are you doing this? She asked softly. You do not know me. You have already saved my life. Why keep helping? Nolan considered the question, trying to find words for feelings he did not fully understand himself. Because it is the right thing to do, he said finally. Because you deserve help. Because I cannot stand the thought of you losing everything when maybe, just maybe, we can get some of it back. That is not a full answer, Tessa said, but she was almost smiling, and some of the sadness had lifted from her expression. It is the only one I have right now, Nolan admitted, and that made her laugh, a sound like silver bells that seemed impossibly bright in the harsh desert landscape. They continued searching as the afternoon lengthened into evening, and Nolan was just about to suggest they turn back when Tessa suddenly pointed to the east, her voice sharp with excitement. There. Is that something near those rocks? Nolan followed her gaze and saw what had caught her attention. A dark shape that did not quite match the surrounding terrain, partially hidden behind a tumble of boulders. His heart began to pound as they urged the horses forward, covering the distance in a hard gallop that made Tessa cling to her saddle horn with white-knuckled hands. As they drew closer, the shape resolved into a wagon, tilted at an awkward angle with one wheel completely shattered, just as Tessa had described. They dismounted and hurried over, and Tessa gave a small cry of relief when she saw that the wagon was still mostly intact. The canvas cover had been torn by wind and weather, flapping loosely in the breeze, but the contents seemed largely untouched. Wooden crates and a large trunk were visible in the bed, along with rolled bundles that Nolan assumed were fabric. A few items had spilled out through tears in the canvas, including a battered cooking pot and some clothes, but overall, it could have been much worse. "It is here," Tessa said, her voice breaking with emotion. "It is all still here." She turned to Nolan with tears streaming down her face, and before he could react, she had thrown her arms around his neck, hugging him with surprising strength. Thank you so much." Nolan stood frozen for a moment, his arms at his sides, completely unprepared for the wave of feeling that crashed over him at her touch. Slowly, carefully, he brought his arms up and returned the embrace, letting himself hold her for just a moment before gently setting her back. Her cheeks were flushed, and she looked embarrassed by her outburst, but she was still smiling through her tears. "We should inventory what is here and figure out how to transport it back to town," Nolan said, his voice rougher than usual. "It will be too heavy to carry on horseback, so we will need to arrange for someone with a wagon to come out and collect it." They spent the next hour going through the wagon's contents, and Nolan was relieved to see that most of Tessa's belongings had survived. The sewing machine was in its crate, undamaged. The trunk held her personal possessions, including clothes, a few books, and a small wooden box that she held close to her chest without opening. The bolts of fabric were dusty but intact, beautiful materials in every color imaginable. Deep burgundies, soft blues, cheerful yellows, elegant blacks and grays. "This is everything I need to start my shop," Tessa said, running her hand reverently over the fabric. "With this, I can build a life here. I can make something of myself." "You will," Nolan said with absolute certainty. "Anyone with your kind of determination is bound to succeed." By the time they finished, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. They marked the location carefully on Nolan's map and took a few of the smaller, more valuable items with them, including Tessa's wooden box and some money she had hidden in a false bottom of the trunk. Then they mounted up and began the long ride back to Taylorsville, racing the failing light. They rode mostly in silence, both exhausted from the long day, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who have begun to trust each other. When they finally reached town, full dark had fallen, and the main street was lit by the warm glow of lamps in windows and the occasional torch outside a saloon or store. Nolan helped Tessa dismount and walked her to the boarding house, where Sarah met them at the door with scolding words about worrying her half to death and missing supper. "I will arrange for a wagon to collect your things tomorrow," Nolan said as they stood on the porch. "Bill Palmer at the general store has one he rents out. It should not cost more than a few dollars." "I can pay for it," Tessa said quickly. "I have some money now, thanks to finding the wagon." "We will work out the details later," Nolan said, too tired to argue. "Right now, you need to eat something and get some sleep. So do I, for that matter." Tessa nodded, but she did not immediately go inside. She stood there looking at him, her expression serious in the lamplight, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but intense. "I meant what I said earlier. You saved my life, and now you have helped me recover everything I thought was lost. I do not know how to thank you properly." "You do not need to thank me," Nolan said. "Just promise me you will take care of yourself, build that shop, make it a success. That is all the thanks I need." She smiled, and it transformed her face, making her look younger and happier than he had yet seen her. "I promise. And Nolan, I hope you will stay in Taylorsville for a while, at least until I can repay you for everything you have done." "I suppose I can spare a few more days," Nolan said, and tried to ignore the way his heart lifted at the prospect of spending more time with her. The next morning, Nolan rented Bill Palmer's wagon and made the trip back out to retrieve Tessa's belongings. He brought along 2 men from the livery stable to help with the heavy lifting, and by early afternoon, they had successfully loaded everything and transported it back to town. Tessa had arranged to rent a small storefront on Main Street, just 3 doors down from the boarding house, and they unloaded her possessions directly into the empty space. The building had been a bakery once, but the previous owner had moved to California 2 years ago, and it had sat vacant ever since. It was small, just one large room with a smaller back room that could serve as storage or workspace, but it had good light from 2 big windows facing the street, and the rent was affordable. Tessa stood in the middle of the empty space, turning in a slow circle with her arms outstretched, and the joy on her face made something in Nolan's chest ache. "It is perfect," she said. "Absolutely perfect. I can put the sewing area in the back, use the front for displays and customer consultations. Maybe get a few dress forms, some nice shelves for fabric." She was talking more to herself than to him, already seeing the space not as it was but as it would be, and Nolan found himself smiling at her enthusiasm. Over the next week, Nolan found excuses to stay in Taylorsville. He told himself he was just making sure Tessa got properly settled, that it was the decent thing to do after everything she had been through. But the truth was more complicated. He looked forward to seeing her each day, to hearing her talk about her plans for the shop, to watching her face light up when she showed him a new piece of fabric or a dress design she had sketched. He helped her build shelves and clean the years of dust from the floors and windows. He moved heavy furniture and hung curtains, and did a dozen other small tasks that she could probably have managed on her own, but seemed grateful for his help with. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side during the day and often sharing meals at the boarding house in the evening. Sarah Jenkins watched them with knowing eyes and made several pointed comments about what a fine couple they made, which never failed to make Tessa blush, and Nolan changed the subject. But even as he deflected Sarah's teasing, Nolan was becoming increasingly aware of his feelings for Tessa. It was more than simple attraction, though he was certainly attracted to her. It was deeper than that, a connection he had never experienced with anyone before. He liked the sound of her laugh, the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating, the stubborn tilt of her chin when she disagreed with him about something. He liked her strength and her vulnerability, her determination and her occasional moments of doubt when she wondered if she was really capable of making her dream a reality. One evening, about 10 days after he had found her in the desert, they were sitting on the porch of the boarding house watching the sun set. Tessa had been quieter than usual all day, and Nolan finally asked her what was wrong. She was silent for a long moment, then said, "You are going to leave soon, are not you? You have to get back to your ranch, and I cannot keep taking advantage of your kindness." Nolan felt something twist in his gut at the thought of leaving. He had been avoiding thinking about it, but she was right. He had already been gone for 2 weeks, far longer than the simple message delivery should have taken. His boss was probably furious, and if he did not get back soon, he might not have a job to return to. "I do need to head back," he admitted, "but Taylorsville is not that far from the ranch. I could visit, check on how the shop is doing." Tessa turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes that made his pulse quicken. "Would you? Visit, I mean?" "If you want me to," Nolan said carefully, not wanting to presume. "I would like that," Tessa said softly. "I would like that very much. I know we have not known each other long, but you have become important to me, Nolan. More important than maybe you should be, given the circumstances. Nolan felt his breath catch. He knew he should be careful, should think about what he was doing before he said something he could not take back. But when he looked at Tessa, at the hope and uncertainty in her expression, all his careful caution crumbled. "You have become important to me too," he said. "More important than anyone has been in a long time, maybe ever." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, and Nolan waited for her response with his heart hammering against his ribs. Tessa's eyes were wide, and he could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. Her skin was warm and slightly rough from work, and the touch sent electricity racing up his arm. "Then do not make me wait too long between visits," she said, and she was smiling, but there were tears in her eyes. "I do not think I could bear it." Nolan lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture that felt both old-fashioned and entirely right. "I will be back before you know it," he promised. "And in the meantime, you are going to build the best dress shop Utah has ever seen." He left the next morning, and saying goodbye to Tessa was one of the hardest things he had ever done. She stood on the porch of the boarding house in the pre-dawn darkness, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill, and watched as he saddled Copper and prepared to ride out. When he mounted up, she came down the steps and placed one hand on his boot, looking up at him with those remarkable eyes. "Be safe," she said. "Always," he replied, and then, because he could not help himself, he leaned down and cupped her face in his hand, running his thumb across her cheekbone. She leaned into the touch, closing her eyes, and for a moment they stayed like that, frozen in the gray light of dawn. Then Nolan straightened, released her, and turned Copper toward the south, riding away without looking back because he knew if he did, he might not be able to leave at all. The ride back to the ranch took 2 days, and Nolan spent most of it thinking about Tessa, remembering the feel of her hand in his, the softness of her skin, the way she had looked at him when he said she was important to him. He had never been the romantic type, had always figured he was too rough, too plain, too set in his ways to interest any woman worth having. But Tessa had looked at him like he hung the moon, and that was a powerful feeling, intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. His boss, a gruff rancher named Tom Harrison, was indeed furious about the delay, but his anger faded somewhat when Nolan explained what had happened. Tom was a hard man, but not an unfair one, and he grudgingly admitted that Nolan had done the right thing by helping a woman in distress. Still, he made it clear that he expected Nolan to work double time to make up for the lost days, and Nolan agreed without complaint. He threw himself into the work with single-minded focus, rising before dawn and working until well after dark, repairing fences, moving cattle, breaking horses, doing whatever needed doing. The physical labor was exhausting but satisfying, and it kept his mind occupied during the day. But at night, lying in his bunk in the ranch house, he thought about Tessa. He wondered if her shop was taking shape, if she had made any sales yet, if she was eating properly and getting enough rest. He composed letters to her in his head, but never wrote them down because he had never been good with words on paper, always felt like they came out stilted and awkward. Instead, he counted down the days until he could justify taking time off to visit Taylorsville again. Meanwhile, in Taylorsville, Tessa was working herself to the bone getting her shop ready. She had placed an advertisement in the local paper announcing the opening of a custom dressmaking business, and to her surprise and delight, she had received several inquiries within days. Women in frontier towns like Taylorsville had limited access to quality clothing, and the prospect of custom-made dresses was appealing to those who could afford it. She took on her first commission 3 weeks after Nolan left, a simple day dress for the wife of a local banker, and completed it in 4 days. The woman was thrilled with the result and immediately ordered 2 more dresses, as well as spreading word of Tessa's skill to her friends. Within a month, Tessa had more work than she could handle alone. She hired a local girl named Emma to help with basic sewing tasks, freeing Tessa to focus on the more complex work of cutting patterns and doing detailed finishing. The shop slowly transformed from an empty space into a charming little business, with bolts of fabric displayed along one wall, a comfortable seating area for consultations, and a large work table in the back room where Tessa spent most of her time. She had her sewing machine set up near the window to take advantage of the natural light, and the steady rhythm of the treadle became a familiar sound on Main Street. But despite her success, Tessa found herself thinking constantly about Nolan. She watched for him every day, her heart leaping every time a rider approached from the south, only to sink with disappointment when it proved to be someone else. She told herself she was being foolish, that he was just a man who had been kind to her in her hour of need, that she should not read too much into his words or the way he had touched her face that last morning. But the truth was that Nolan Jameson had worked his way into her heart with surprising speed, and his absence left a hollow ache in her chest that no amount of work could fill. 6 weeks after he left, on a bright October morning with the first hint of winter chill in the air, Nolan rode back into Taylorsville. Tessa was in her shop, bent over a complicated bodice she was hand-stitching, when she heard the door open. She looked up with a polite greeting on her lips, and the words died when she saw who stood in the doorway. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face tanned even darker from long days in the sun, but his eyes were the same, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the shop, and then Tessa was moving, crossing the space between them without conscious thought. She stopped just short of touching him, suddenly unsure, but Nolan had no such hesitation. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, and Tessa wrapped her arms around his waist and buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and horse, and something uniquely him. "I missed you," she said, her voice muffled by his shirt. "I missed you too," Nolan replied, and his voice was rough with emotion. "Every single day." They stood like that for a long moment before Tessa reluctantly pulled back, suddenly aware that they were in full view of anyone passing by the shop windows. Emma was in the back room, but she could emerge at any moment, and Tessa did not want to be the subject of gossip, even though she suspected that ship had probably already sailed. "The shop looks amazing," Nolan said, looking around at the transformation. "You have done all this in 6 weeks." "I have been busy," Tessa said, and could not quite keep the pride from her voice. "Business has been better than I hoped. I actually have more work than I can manage alone, which is why I hired Emma." She gestured toward the back room. "Would you like to see the workspace?" She gave him a tour, showing off her organized supplies, the dress forms she had purchased, the rack of completed garments waiting to be picked up by customers. Nolan listened and asked questions, and she could tell he was genuinely interested, not just humoring her. When they finished the tour, she made tea, and they sat in the consultation area, catching up on everything that had happened since they last saw each other. Nolan told her about the ranch, about the work he did, and the men he worked with, about Tom Harrison's grudging acceptance of his extended absence. Tessa told him about her growing business, about the women she had met, and the friendships she was forming, about her plans to expand her inventory, to include ready-made items like aprons and simple blouses for those who could not afford custom work. They talked for hours, until the light faded outside and Emma emerged from the back room with a pointed comment about needing to get home to help her mother with supper. After Emma left, Nolan asked if Tessa would have dinner with him at the hotel restaurant. It was the only proper eating establishment in Taylorsville, and while it was not fancy, it was clean and the food was decent. Tessa agreed immediately, and they walked the short distance together, their hands brushing occasionally in a way that seemed both accidental and entirely deliberate. Over dinner, Nolan admitted that he had not been able to stop thinking about her, that she had been a constant presence in his mind even when he was working himself to exhaustion. Tessa, emboldened by his honesty, confessed that she had felt the same, that she had been watching for him every day, hoping he would return. The conversation grew more serious, more weighted with meaning, and by the time they finished eating, there was no denying the feelings that had developed between them. "I know this is fast," Nolan said as they walked back toward the boarding house under a sky full of stars. "We have known each other less than 2 months, but Tessa, I cannot remember the last time I felt this way about anyone, maybe never. You make me want things I convinced myself I could never have." "What kind of things?" Tessa asked, her heart pounding. "A home," Nolan said simply. "A family. Someone to come back to at the end of the day. Someone who makes all the hard work feel worthwhile. I know I am just a ranch hand, and I do not have much to offer, but if you would be willing to take a chance on me, I promise I will spend every day trying to make you happy." Tessa stopped walking and turned to face him, reaching up to place her hands on either side of his face. "Nolan Jameson, you saved my life. You have been nothing but kind and generous and patient with me. You make me feel safe and valued and cherished. I do not care that you are a ranch hand. I care that you are a good man, maybe the best man I have ever known. So yes, I will absolutely take a chance on you if you will take one on me." Nolan's answer was to kiss her, slow and sweet and full of promise. It was not Tessa's first kiss by any means, but it felt like it, felt like everything was new and bright and full of possibility. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nolan rested his forehead against hers and smiled. "I guess this means we are courting now," he said. "I guess it does," Tessa agreed, and laughed because she felt lighter than she had in years, maybe ever. Nolan stayed in Taylorsville for 4 days that time, and they spent every possible moment together. He helped her in the shop, proving surprisingly adept at measuring fabric and organizing supplies. They took long walks in the evening, talking about everything and nothing, learning the small details of each other's lives. Nolan told her about growing up on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri, about losing his parents to illness when he was 16 and making his way west to find work. Tessa told him about her first marriage, about how she and her husband had been more friends than passionate lovers, how his death had been sad but not devastating because she had never been in love with him, not really. She felt guilty admitting that, but Nolan just took her hand and told her there was nothing wrong with the truth. When it came time for him to leave again, the goodbye was just as hard as the first time, but tempered now by the certainty that he would return, that this was not an ending but a beginning. They made plans for him to visit again in a month, and in the meantime, Nolan promised to write, even if his letters were awkward and poorly worded. Tessa promised to write back and tell him all about the shop and her life in Taylorsville. The months that followed fell into a pattern. Nolan would visit every 4 to 6 weeks, staying for a few days each time, and between visits, they exchanged letters that grew progressively more intimate and affectionate. Tessa looked forward to those letters like a child anticipating Christmas, and she read each one multiple times, memorizing Nolan's awkward, earnest words. Her business continued to grow, and she became a respected member of the community, known for her skill with a needle and her fair prices. People liked her, and she found herself building the kind of life she had dreamed of during those long months after her first husband died. But the best part of her new life was Nolan. With each visit, their feelings deepened, moving from tentative affection to something much stronger and more permanent. By the time spring arrived, nearly a year after he had first found her passed out in the desert, Tessa knew with absolute certainty that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with this quiet, steadfast man who had quite literally saved her. It was during one of his visits in April that Nolan officially proposed. They were on one of their evening walks, following a path that led out of town toward a small creek that was running high with snowmelt from the mountains. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of gold and pink, and Tessa was talking about possibly expanding the shop, maybe hiring another girl to help with the increased workload. Nolan was quiet, which was not unusual, but there was a tension in his silence that made Tessa trail off mid-sentence and look at him with concern. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Nolan stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Nothing is wrong," he said. "Actually, everything is about as right as it could possibly be. Tessa, I have been thinking about this for months now, trying to figure out the right time and the right words, but I do not think there is such a thing as a perfect moment, so I am just going to say it." He took a deep breath, and Tessa felt her heart begin to race as she realized what was about to happen. "I love you," Nolan said, and his voice was steady and sure. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you lying there in the desert, so vulnerable and brave at the same time. Every day since then, I have loved you more. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it. So I am asking, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making you happy?" Tessa felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling, and her answer came without hesitation. "Yes. Yes, of course I will marry you. I love you too, Nolan. I love you so much." Nolan let out a breath that sounded like relief and joy combined, and he pulled her into his arms, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band set with a small diamond. It was not flashy or expensive, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, and Tessa gasped when she saw it. "I know it is not much," Nolan said, suddenly uncertain, "but it is the best I could afford, and I wanted you to have something to wear to show everyone you are spoken for." "It is perfect," Tessa said, her voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." She held out her hand, and Nolan slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, and Tessa could not stop staring at it, at the physical symbol of the promise they had just made to each other. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Taylorsville. Tessa wore a dress she had made herself, a beautiful creation of ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Sarah Jenkins cried through the entire ceremony, as did several of Tessa's customers who had become friends. Nolan wore a new suit, stiff and uncomfortable but making him look impossibly handsome. And when he said his vows, his voice was clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the church. Tom Harrison had given Nolan time off for the wedding and a brief honeymoon, and they spent 3 days in Salt Lake City, staying in a real hotel with a private room and dining in restaurants fancier than either of them had experienced before. It was magical and wonderful, and Tessa felt like she was living in a dream. But the best part was not the fancy surroundings or the novelty of the city. It was simply being with Nolan, belonging to him and having him belong to her in return. They talked about their future, about their hopes and dreams, about the life they would build together. The question of where they would live had been a source of some anxiety for both of them. Nolan's work was at the ranch, but Tessa's business was in Taylorsville, and neither wanted to ask the other to give up what they had worked so hard to build. In the end, they decided on a compromise. Nolan would continue working at the ranch during the week, but would come home to Taylorsville on weekends. It was not ideal, but it was workable, and both of them believed that eventually they would find a better solution. That solution came sooner than expected. 2 months after the wedding, Tom Harrison approached Nolan with an offer. One of the smaller ranches adjacent to Harrison's property was for sale, about 200 acres with a decent house and good grazing land. Tom offered to help Nolan secure a loan to buy it, with the understanding that Nolan would sell Harrison first rights to any cattle he raised, and would continue to help out during busy seasons like roundup and branding. It was a generous offer, one that would allow Nolan to become his own boss while still maintaining the security of Tom's support. Nolan discussed it with Tessa, and together they looked at the property. The house was small but solid, with 3 rooms and a good fireplace, and the land was beautiful, rolling hills covered with grass and dotted with juniper trees. Best of all, it was only about 5 miles from Taylorsville, close enough that Tessa could easily continue running her shop while living on the ranch. They decided to take the risk, to invest in their future and build something that was truly theirs. The negotiations took several weeks, but by late summer, Nolan and Tessa Jameson were the proud owners of a small cattle ranch. They spent every spare moment fixing up the house, making it into a real home. Tessa sewed curtains for the windows and a quilt for their bed. Nolan built furniture, sturdy and practical but made with care. They planted a vegetable garden and bought chickens, and slowly but surely, the ranch began to feel like the home they had both been searching for. Tessa continued to run her shop in Taylorsville, making the trip into town 3 or 4 days a week. Emma had become skilled enough to handle much of the day-to-day work, and Tessa was able to focus on the more complex commissions and on managing the business side of things. The shop continued to thrive, and Tessa was proud of what she had built, proud that she was contributing to their family's financial security. Their first winter as husband and wife was hard but joyful. The work of running a ranch was endless, particularly for Nolan, who was still learning the ins and outs of managing his own herd. There were cold mornings when the water froze in the troughs and had to be broken up with an axe, days when the wind blew so hard it felt like it would tear the roof off the house. But there were also quiet evenings by the fire, Nolan reading while Tessa sewed, the comfortable silence of 2 people who had found their place in the world. They talked about everything, their conversations ranging from the practical details of ranch management to deeper questions about what they wanted from life. They learned each other's rhythms and moods, learned when to give space and when to offer comfort. In the spring, Tessa discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but waited to be sure before telling Nolan. When she finally gave him the news one evening after supper, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He stared at her for a long moment, as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing, and then his face split into the biggest smile she had ever seen. He picked her up and spun her around, just as he had when she agreed to marry him, and when he set her down, there were tears in his eyes. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Tessa, we are going to be parents." "We are," she confirmed, and she was crying too, happy tears that she did not bother to wipe away. "Are you happy?" "Happy," Nolan laughed, a sound of pure joy. "I am terrified and thrilled and so incredibly grateful. You have given me everything, Tessa. Everything I never even knew I wanted. The pregnancy was relatively easy, and Tessa continued working at the shop well into her 7th month before Emma and Sarah finally convinced her to slow down. She spent her final weeks preparing for the baby, sewing tiny clothes and blankets, setting up a cradle in the corner of their bedroom that Nolan had built with his own hands. They did not know if the baby would be a boy or a girl, but both of them were excited either way, already in love with this tiny person they had not yet met. Tessa went into labor on a warm day in early October, almost exactly 2 years after Nolan had proposed. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and there were moments when Nolan was genuinely afraid that he would lose her. Dr. Morrison, who had made the trip out to the ranch to attend the birth, remained calm and reassuring, but Nolan could see the concern in his eyes as the hours dragged on. He held Tessa's hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement and love, feeling utterly helpless in the face of her pain. But Tessa was strong, stronger than she looked, and just before dawn their son entered the world with a lusty cry that seemed impossibly loud from such a tiny body. Dr. Morrison cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket before placing him in Tessa's arms, and Nolan felt something in his chest crack wide open at the sight of his wife holding their child. She looked exhausted but radiant, her face glowing with love and wonder as she gazed down at the baby. "He is perfect," she whispered. "Nolan, he is absolutely perfect." Nolan leaned in close, looking at his son for the first time. The baby had a shock of dark hair and tiny, perfect features, and his eyes, when they opened briefly, were a deep, unfocused blue. Nolan reached out with one finger and gently stroked the baby's cheek, marveling at the softness of his skin. "What should we name him?" Tessa asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had never quite settled on anything. Now, looking at his son, Nolan thought of his own father, a good man who had died too young. "What about Daniel?" he suggested. "Daniel Robert, after my father." Tessa smiled and looked down at the baby. "Daniel Robert Jameson, I like it. Hello, Daniel. Welcome to the world, little one." Parenthood changed everything and nothing all at once. The ranch work still needed doing, and Tessa still ran her business, though she did more work from home now and relied heavily on Emma to manage the shop. But their priorities shifted, their world narrowing to encompass this tiny person who depended on them for everything. Nolan discovered depths of patience he had not known he possessed, spending hours rocking Daniel when he cried, changing diapers with increasingly practiced efficiency, singing off key lullabies in the middle of the night when Tessa was too exhausted to get up again. Daniel was a good baby, healthy and curious and already showing signs of the stubbornness he had inherited from both his parents. He grew quickly, reaching all his milestones right on schedule, and both Nolan and Tessa marveled at every new development, every smile and laugh and babbled word. When Daniel took his first steps at 11 months, tottering across the floor of the ranch house with his arms outstretched for balance, Nolan and Tessa both cheered as if he had accomplished something truly remarkable. The years passed in a blur of work and family, challenges and triumphs, small disappointments and great joys. The ranch prospered, slowly but steadily, and Nolan earned a reputation as a fair and capable cattleman. Tessa's shop remained successful, and she eventually hired 2 more girls to help manage the workload, allowing her to spend more time at home with Daniel. When Daniel was 3, Tessa became pregnant again, and this time they welcomed a daughter they named Rose, after Tessa's mother. Rose was different from Daniel, quieter and more contemplative, but just as loved. They added on to the house as the family grew, building 2 more bedrooms and expanding the kitchen. The ranch grew too, as they were able to purchase an additional 100 acres from a neighbor who was retiring and moving back east. It was not an easy life, but it was a good one, filled with the kind of solid satisfaction that comes from building something lasting with your own hands and heart. Through it all, the love between Nolan and Tessa only deepened. They had their disagreements, of course, their moments of frustration and fatigue when the pressures of running a ranch and raising children felt overwhelming. But they always came back to each other, always remembered that they were a team, partners in every sense of the word. Nolan never stopped being grateful for the day he found Tessa passed out in the desert, never stopped marveling at the chain of events that had brought them together. Tessa never stopped being amazed that she had found a man who loved her so completely, who supported her dreams while building his own, who was as good a father as he was a husband. On warm summer evenings, they would sometimes sit on the porch after the children were asleep, watching the sun set over the mountains and talking about their day. Those were Nolan's favorite times, when it was just the two of them and the world felt quiet and peaceful. He would reach over and take Tessa's hand, lacing his fingers through hers just as he had done that first night when they admitted their feelings for each other, and she would lean her head on his shoulder, content and complete. When Daniel was 10 and Rose was 7, Nolan and Tessa were surprised to discover they were expecting again. It had been years since they had seriously considered having more children, and the news brought a mix of excitement and trepidation. But their third child, a boy they named Samuel, proved to be an unexpected blessing, filling the house with new energy and laughter. Daniel and Rose doted on their little brother, and Samuel grew up surrounded by love and the kind of security that comes from being part of a strong, stable family. As the children grew, Nolan made sure to teach them about the ranch, about the value of hard work and responsibility. Daniel showed an early aptitude for cattle work, and by the time he was 12, he was helping with roundups and proving himself to be a capable young ranch hand. Rose, meanwhile, showed her mother's talent for sewing and design, and Tessa began teaching her the trade, passing on skills and knowledge that had been Tessa's salvation in the years after her first husband died. Samuel was still too young to know where his interests lay, but he was curious and enthusiastic about everything, and both Nolan and Tessa looked forward to discovering what kind of man he would become. The shop in Taylorsville continued to operate successfully for many years, eventually becoming one of the most respected businesses in town. When Tessa turned 40, she made the difficult decision to sell the shop to Emma, who had been with her from nearly the beginning and had become like a sister. It was time, Tessa decided, to focus fully on the ranch and the family, to step back from the daily grind of running a business and enjoy the fruits of all her hard work. The sale provided a nice financial cushion, allowing them to make further improvements to the ranch and to set aside money for the children's futures. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Nolan surprised Tessa with a trip back to Salt Lake City, just the two of them, leaving the children in the capable hands of Sarah Jenkins, who had become like a grandmother to all three. They stayed in the same hotel where they had spent their honeymoon, and it was strange and wonderful to be back there, to remember the young couple they had been and compare them to the mature, confident people they had become. "You ever regret it?" Nolan asked one evening as they walked through the city streets. "Marrying a ranch hand, building this life instead of something easier." Tessa stopped walking and turned to face him, cupping his weathered face in her hands. He was older now, lines deeply etched around his eyes and mouth, his dark hair shot through with gray. But to her, he was still the most handsome man she had ever known, and the love she saw in his eyes was as strong as it had been on their wedding day. "Not for a single second," she said firmly. "Nolan, you gave me everything. You saved my life, yes, but more than that, you gave me a reason to live. You gave me love and family and purpose. I cannot imagine any other life being better than this one." "Good," Nolan said and kissed her, slow and deep, right there on the street where anyone could see. "Because I feel exactly the same way." They returned home to the ranch renewed and recommitted, ready to face whatever the future held, and the future brought its share of challenges. There was the year the drought came and they lost half their herd. The winter when Rose fell through the ice on the creek and nearly drowned, saved only by Daniel's quick thinking and Nolan's strong arms pulling her to safety. The time Samuel broke his arm falling from a horse, and Tessa sat up with him all night, fighting her terror and exhaustion to keep him comfortable and calm. But there were far more good times than bad. Daniel's wedding to a sweet girl named Catherine from a neighboring ranch, and the joy of becoming grandparents when their first grandson was born. Rose's decision to stay in Taylorsville and open her own dressmaking business, following in her mother's footsteps, but adding her own modern touches and ideas. Samuel's announcement at 16 that he wanted to be a veterinarian, and the pride Nolan and Tessa felt watching him work toward that goal with single-minded determination. As they grew older, Nolan and Tessa gradually stepped back from the day-to-day running of the ranch, turning over more and more responsibility to Daniel and his growing family. It was hard to let go, to accept that they were entering a new phase of life, but it was also a relief to have more time to simply enjoy each other's company, to travel a little, to visit with friends and watch their grandchildren grow. On a warm spring evening, nearly 40 years after the day Nolan found Tessa passed out in the desert, they sat together on their porch watching the sunset, a ritual that had become sacred to them over the decades. Nolan was 70 now, his hair completely white, his hands gnarled from years of hard work. Tessa was 68, her dark hair also white, her face lined with age but still beautiful in Nolan's eyes. They held hands as they always did, comfortable in the silence that had defined so much of their relationship. "You remember the day we met?" Tessa asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. "When you found me in the desert?" "Of course I remember," Nolan said. "I think about it all the time. I think about how close I came to never finding you, to riding right past without seeing you there. My life would have been so different, so much emptier." "Mine too," Tessa said softly. "I was so lost that day in every possible way. Lost physically, yes, but also lost in my life, not knowing where I belonged or what I was supposed to do. And then you found me and everything changed. You showed me what love could be, what family meant. You gave me a home, Nolan. Not just this house or this ranch, but a real home, the kind I had been searching for my whole life." Nolan squeezed her hand, feeling the emotion rise in his throat. "You gave me the same thing. Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions. You made me want to live, really live. You made me believe I deserved happiness." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching as the sun dipped below the mountains and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. From inside the house, they could hear the sounds of family, Daniel and Catherine getting the children ready for bed, the familiar sounds of home and belonging. "I love you," Tessa said, as she had said countless times over the years, but it never got old, never lost its power. "I love you too," Nolan replied, turning to kiss her temple. "Always have, always will." And as the stars came out one by one, filling the vast Utah sky with their ancient light, Nolan and Tessa Jameson sat together on their porch. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together that was richer and fuller than either could have imagined. The desert that had nearly claimed Tessa's life had instead become the setting for their greatest blessing, and neither of them would have changed a single thing about the journey that had brought them to this moment. Surrounded by love, secure in the knowledge that they had lived well and loved deeply. The ranch continued to prosper under Daniel's management, and eventually his own children grew up to help run it, ensuring that the Jameson legacy would continue for generations. Rose's dress shop became the finest in the region, and she married a kind man who supported her ambitions and gave her 3 daughters who inherited her talent for design. Samuel became a successful veterinarian, traveling throughout Utah and neighboring territories to care for animals, his compassion and skill making him beloved in every community he served. Nolan and Tessa lived to see all their children settled and happy, to hold and love a total of 9 grandchildren, and even meet a few great-grandchildren before they were done. They watched the world change around them, saw the wild frontier they had known gradually transform into something more civilized and settled. But through all the changes, their love remained constant, the foundation upon which everything else was built. When Nolan finally passed away at the age of 78, peacefully in his sleep with Tessa holding his hand, the entire community mourned. He had been respected and loved, known for his fairness, his hard work, and his devotion to his family. Tessa grieved deeply, feeling the loss like a physical wound, but she was sustained by the memories of their life together, by the family they had created, by the absolute certainty that she had been truly and deeply loved. She lived another 5 years, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, telling stories about Nolan and their life together, making sure the younger generation understood where they came from and what values had built the family they were all part of. And when her own time came, passing quietly in her favorite chair with Rose sitting beside her, her last thoughts were of Nolan, of the day he had found her in the desert and changed everything, of the love that had defined her life and made every struggle worthwhile. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the endless Utah sky they had both loved. The headstone was simple, bearing their names and the dates of their lives, but to those who had known them, no words could truly capture the depth of their love or the richness of the life they had shared. Their story became part of family legend, told and retold to each new generation, a testament to the power of love, the importance of kindness, and the beautiful truth that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead directly to the best, if we are brave enough to seize the opportunities they present. The ranch continued, the family grew, and the legacy of Nolan and Tessa Jameson lived on, not just in the land and buildings they had worked so hard to establish, but in the values they had instilled in their children and their children's children. Hard work, integrity, compassion, and above all, the understanding that love, real and true and lasting, was the greatest treasure anyone could ever hope to find. And it had all begun with a cowboy riding through the desert on a sweltering August day, finding a woman passed out from the heat, pouring water on her face, and carrying her to shade, never knowing that in saving her life, he was also finding his own greatest happiness and the love that would define him for all his days.